Hey folks, Eder from Brain Pulp TV, and it is, as of this recording, just after midnight on April 27th, 2019. It is the pre-release weekend for the newest expansion for Magic the Gathering, War of the Spark. Now, as is the case with most of the new expansions that have come out, there are two new Planeswalker decks that have been released along with it. In this case, Gideon the Oathsworn, which is a white-black deck, and Jace Arcane Strategist, which is a blue-green deck. So what I like to do when these new Planeswalker decks are released is open them up, show you guys what's inside, then go through the deck card by card, talk about the strategy, the thought behind the deck, as well as, in a lot of cases, some of the ways that these decks could have been improved. Now, since there are two decks, there are going to be two separate videos in which I'm going to be opening these up and showing you. Now, if you've seen the other Planeswalker deck opening I've done for War of the Spark, I'm going to show a time code on screen right now where you can sort of skip ahead because the intros to these decks are essentially the same. They don't really start to become different until I actually start talking about the deck itself. So if you've seen the other one and you want to skip ahead, feel free to skip to this particular time and you can get right into me talking about the deck itself. However, if you have not seen the other Planeswalker deck opening or haven't seen any of the other Planeswalker deck openings I've done before, let me just talk a little bit about what a Planeswalker deck is. These are 60 card standard legal decks which are comprised of the set or expansion that they have been released within. So in this case, there are only going to be cards from War of the Spark inside this particular Planeswalker deck. Now, another thing to point out as well too is that these decks are not meant to be super competitive decks. These are very much targeted towards new or casual players who just want to have a bit of fun, have a couple of ready-made decks which you can battle it out with your friends, and not really worried about taking them to like a tournament or Friday Night Magic and trying to blow the doors off the format. So yes, if you are a more advanced player or someone who's getting more and more into competitive Magic, you may want to sort of look towards the challenger decks if you're looking for a pre-made deck. But if you just want to have some fun with a friend, these are great little decks where you can sort of start out and try to learn Magic. As well too, when new Planeswalker decks come out, we always battle them against each other on a show we call the Mana Cave, in a series we call the Planeswalker Deck Showdown, where we take all the Planeswalker decks within a certain season, battle them out to see which one is going to reign supreme at the end of the season. Okay, so everything else I pretty much want to talk about when it comes to the Planeswalker decks, it's a lot easier to do as I'm opening them up and showing you what's inside. So we're going to kick off the actual opening part of this deck. And in this video, we're going to be tackling the Jace Arcane Strategist deck. Okay, first and foremost, as you can see on the outside of the box, and as you're going to be able to see in just a second on the inside of the box, there is a nice foil featured Planeswalker in this deck. So yes, it is foil, nice and shiny, which means sadly it's probably going to start curling right away, but for now it's rather flat because it's in the packaging. I'll talk more about that in just a bit when I start going over the deck itself. There's also this nice, lovely deck box which comes with each of the Planeswalker decks. You can fit sleeved cards in here, so you can sleeve up this deck and put it in this box. Now, some people have said that they've had some issues with it. If you're using like Dragon Shield sleeves, standard Dragon Shield sleeves, you shouldn't have any problem sleeving them up and fitting them all in this box. So that should work out just perfect for you. I use Dragon Shield sleeves. I've also used some of the Ultra Pro sleeves as well too, and they all basically seem to fit as long as they're sort of a standard size. Now inside the box, you can actually see the brick of cards, which is the deck itself. Once again, I'm going to open that up in a second. I'm going to be talking about the deck, but there's also a few other cards in there that I'm going to be talking about in just a moment as well. There's also two booster packs of War of the Spark, so I'm going to be opening those up at the end of the video after I sort of go over the deck itself. As well too, there is this little full color fold out which talks a bit about the Planeswalker from the deck. Also mentions some of the mechanics you will find within this deck. They used to have the deck lists printed on these things. They don't anymore, so they're not quite as useful as they may have been at one point. However, if you're brand new to Magic and you're completely unaware of any of the mechanics, this could actually be a bit useful for you. Okay, now before I get into talking about the Planeswalker and the deck, there are a few additional cards sealed up in this little brick that I do want to sort of discuss because they can be quite useful, especially one card in particular, which I think is a great addition to these Planeswalker decks. Now, originally with the Planeswalker decks, as well as a lot of the pre-con decks, there was this little sort of fold out which would go over some of the basic rules of Magic, including what you can do in your turn and when and that sort of thing. They since replaced that with a couple of extra cards that they include with these decks instead. So as you can see here, this card talks about how to cast spells, and on the other side, there is the ins and outs of attacking and blocking. This card, on the other hand, talks about what you can do on your turn and the various phases within a turn of Magic, and it also mentions a website in the back, learnmagic.wizards.com, where you can learn a bit more about Magic and how to play. Now, while those cards are nice and can be to a certain degree rather useful, especially for very, very new players, the card in here that I think is the most important, especially if you are already on Magic Arena, is this card. Not this side that I'm showing you right now, but the other side here, which has a special code that you can enter into your Magic Arena account, and you will be able to get a copy of this Planeswalker deck in digital form. So it basically doubles up the usefulness of one of these Planeswalker decks. Now you can play it on paper with your friends, or you can play it online on Magic Arena with your friends. So if you haven't started playing Magic Arena, they're not a sponsor, so I'm not saying this because they're a sponsor or anything like that, but I would definitely suggest you sort of try Magic Arena out, because you don't necessarily have to pay anything if you don't want to, and things like this allow you to sort of build up a collection and get into playing fairly quickly for zero money involved. And if you do want to invest some money into it, you can try different things like different drafts and what have you, but there are also other ways to earn currency within that game, gain more cards, play more different types of decks. So yeah, it's definitely something that's worth checking out, especially if you're a big fan of Magic, or if you're getting into it and you may want another avenue to learn a bit more or to play a bit more. Okay, so now that I am done talking about everything that isn't the Planeswalker and the actual cards within this deck, let's talk about the deck itself. Now, I'm going to do this by starting off with the Planeswalker, and then I'm going to talk about the cards that are exclusive to this deck that you're not going to be able to find in regular booster packs. Then I'm going to go through the creatures, the non-creature spells, and eventually the land base. And all of that I'm going to go through in order of converted mana cost. Oh yeah, and as well too, I am going to go over one additional Planeswalker which is in this deck. So I will do that right after talking about the cards that are exclusive to this deck. Alrighty folks, so we're going to kick things off by talking about Jace, the Arcane Strategist. So for 4 and 2 blue, you get a 4 loyalty Planeswalker. His static ability, which is always in effect as long as Jace is on the battlefield, is whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. His +1 is draw a card, and his -7 ultimate ability is creatures you control can't be blocked this turn. Now, I think in pretty much every one of these overviews that I've done for the Planeswalker deck Planeswalkers, I've always said when it comes to their ultimate, chances are you're never going to be able to use it. However, with Jace here, there's actually a very good chance that you could use his ultimate at least once in a game. And the big reason for that is the fact that there are a lot of cards in this deck that have proliferate. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with proliferate, it allows you to put an additional counter on any permanent or player that already has a counter on it. So creatures that have +1/+1 counters on it will get an additional +1/+1 counter. Planeswalkers will get an additional loyalty counter. So with Jace, on turn 6, you get him into play. He starts off 4 loyalty. You +1 him, he's now at 5. The very next turn, if you have 2 of your triggers when it comes to proliferate, you could get him up to 7 right then and there. So it is entirely possible by the second turn that he is in play that you could have him at 7 loyalty. I'm not sure if it's super likely, but it is possible. And if you have any sort of board state, creatures you control can't be blocked this turn is going to be devastating to your opponent. If you have lethal, it's just game over. If you have close to lethal, it's going to put them on their back heel. So overall, this is one of the best chances you're ever going to get when it comes to using a Planeswalker deck, Planeswalker's ultimate ability. Now, to a certain degree, this actually makes me a little bit sad because a lot of the ultimate abilities for Planeswalkers, even in Planeswalker decks, are huge, absolutely crazy huge. Now, this does, as I said before, have a potential impact to the game. If you've got a decent board state, this could mean lethal, but it is completely dependent on you having a decent number of creatures, or at least a few really powerful creatures on the battlefield, which may not always be the case. And because it's a -7 ability, if you do get to use it, chances are you're either going to kill off Jace that way or put him down to a very, very low loyalty count, which means you're going to have a long way to go before you can use it again. Okay, moving on now to his +1 ability. Now, his +1 ability is something you've seen with blue Planeswalkers from these Planeswalker decks before, which is simply draw a card. It's not terribly exciting, but remember, it does work well with his static ability. So whenever you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So you've already drawn at the very beginning of your turn. That counts as your first draw. If you get Jace on the battlefield and immediately +1 him, his +1 really acts more like draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Because one of the things to keep in mind is that effect doesn't start counting the cards you drew per turn once it's on the battlefield. it's going to go back and count the fact that you did draw a card at the very beginning of the turn, regardless of whether or not Jace was on the battlefield at that point, which means his +1 draw card ability will most likely be the second card you draw that turn. And yes, that means from here on out, even if you don't have any other cards in hand or on the battlefield that can draw you extra cards, his +1 ability will trigger his static ability each and every turn. So is Jace Arcane Strategist the best Planeswalker they've ever come out with these Planeswalker decks? No. Does his abilities work really well given the rest of his deck? Yes. I think he's got a fair amount of synergy with his deck, more so than a lot of the Planeswalkers in the past have done with these Planeswalker decks. Okay, let's move on now to one of the other cards which is exclusive to this Planeswalker deck. And we're going to start off with the Tutor card. For those of you unfamiliar, Tutor cards are cards which allow you to search your graveyard, your library, or whatever, and find a card and put it into your hand or on top of your library. In this case, this card will put something into your hand, and it is Jace's Ruse. So you get 2 copies of the sorcery. For 3 and 2 blue, return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hand. You may search your library and or graveyard for a card named Jace Arcane Strategist, reveal it, put it into your hand. If you search your library this way, shuffle it. So other than the ones from M19, every single Planeswalker deck has a card like this, which allows you to search your library or graveyard and grab your Planeswalker and put it into your hand. This is extremely useful for obvious reasons. One, it's always great to be able to find your Planeswalker when you want to and put it into your hand. But the other thing as well too is, because you only get 1 copy of your Planeswalker, and this allows you to search your graveyard, this gives you the opportunity to play your Planeswalker more than just once per game if it happens to die after it hits the battlefield. So what this card does is it creates a tempo shift. For example, if your opponent spent their entire mana base on their previous turn to get 1 single creature on the board, and now it's your turn and you can bounce that creature plus another one back into their hand, they've essentially lost everything they've done when it comes to casting on their previous turn. It sets them back not only the creature that they spent all their mana on, but also 1 additional creature which is no longer on the board and they're going to have to recast. Another thing to keep in mind when bouncing creatures is that, for example, this deck is going to be played against the Gideon version of the War of the Spark deck. So that deck has a lot of creatures which gain +1/+1 counters over time. When you bounce a creature like that back to your opponent's hand, it's going to lose all those counters. So for example, with something like a Johnny's Pridemate, which only costs 2 to cast, it's not going to be that difficult for them to simply recast it. But if they've been building up +1/+1 counters on that through most of the game, they've lost all of that progress and have to start from scratch again. Maybe they no longer have lifelinkers on the board, which can pump it up. That is a huge tempo shift as well too. Okay, so I've been wanting to make a point of sort of pointing out all of the good in this card because there is one major thing with this card that I'm not particularly fond of. And that's the fact that it's a sorcery speed card. If this card was instant speed, I would probably have little to no problem with it because you can cast it at the end of your opponent's turn. They have no chance to recast their creatures, and all of a sudden it's a huge surprise to your opponent. Because it's sorcery speed and because it costs 5, this card is probably going to take up your entire turn. Granted, it is going to affect the battlefield on your opponent's side, but there's no surprise to it, and they will most likely be able to recast their creatures, especially once again in the case of the War of the Spark Gideon deck, because most of those creatures cost very little to recast. Now, you do get to set them back if they have counters on it. At the same time, you lose something with this card having to be sorcery speed. Okay, moving on now from a sorcery spell to a creature, we have another one of the exclusive cards in this deck, and that is Guildpact Informant. For 2 and a blue, you get a 1/1 flying fairy rogue creature, and it has the ability of, whenever it deals combat damage to a player or a planeswalker, proliferate. Proliferate, as I sort of mentioned before, is choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. So this creature isn't strictly bad. It is a 1/1 flyer for 3, which actually is less than desirable. Its ability, though, can be quite useful, especially in a deck like this, where you're able to put +1/+1 counters on things, or you have planeswalkers that have loyalty counters already on them. But a 1/1 flyer for 3. This is only going to be used in order to help proliferate. So unless you've already built up a decent board that this can actually have some impact on, it's not great. Then it's just a 1/1 flyer for 3. It doesn't affect itself. It doesn't put +1/+1 counters on things that don't already have +1/+1 counters. And you get 4 copies of this in the deck. So you're really going to need to make sure that you have other creatures that this can benefit from. Otherwise, this is just a very expensive 1/1 flyer. Now, granted, it is going to be able to go over top of the heads of a lot of blocking creatures. However, if you are playing the Ajani deck, keep in mind, they have a 1/3 flyer that they can get out on turn 2, a full turn before this one can ever hit the battlefield. So if that's out there, this is not going to be effective at all. Next up, we have the final card, which is exclusive to this deck, and that is Jace's Projection. For 2 and 2 blue, you get a 2/2 Wizard Illusion. Whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Jace's Projection. For 3 and 1 blue, put a loyalty counter on target Jace Planeswalker. So this is a very common type of card that they include with these Planeswalker decks. Cards which have some sort of benefit if you already have your Planeswalker on the battlefield. But unlike the Tutor card, this doesn't just affect the Planeswalker from this deck. So it's not put a loyalty counter on target Jace Arcane Strategist, it's put a loyalty counter on Jace Planeswalker. So regardless of what Jace Planeswalker you have in the battlefield, this can still affect it. This gives this card a little bit more playability than the Tutor card, which is only going to affect, as far as the Tutor effect goes, Jace Arcane Strategist. So you might be able to put this into another deck which uses other Jace Planeswalkers. I don't know how likely that will be, but you do at least have that option. Now, a 2/2 for 4, especially when 2 of those 4 are double blue, isn't necessarily great. But its other ability, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Jace's Projection, is extremely useful. This is every single time you draw a card. So at the beginning of your draw step, a +1/+1 counter is going to go on this, which means at the very beginning of your next turn, it's going to be a 3/3. If you happen to have a draw spell in hand and you can draw for 2 or 3 cards, that means an additional 2 or 3 counters go on this. So by the second turn that this is in play, this could potentially be a 6/6 depending on the cards you have in hand. So one of the things you're going to notice with this deck as I go through and talk about more and more of the creatures is that there's going to be this sweet spot with this deck where by turn 5 or 4, if you're extremely lucky with the little bit of ramp they put in this deck, if you can make it to turn 4 or 5 and have a stable board, then you might start running away with the game, or at least the battlefield, and start to have a more powerful battlefield than your opponent. It's going to take a little while to get there, especially if you're going up against something like the Gideon War of the Spark Planeswalker deck, because they get such a great early start. But if you can stabilize by turn 4 or 5, this deck can really start to take off, and Jace's Projection is a good example of one of the cards which will allow you to do that. Okay, so now that we've talked about all the exclusive cards in this deck, let's talk about the only other Planeswalker you're going to find in this deck. You're going to get 1 copy of Kiora Behemoth Beckoner. So for 2 and a hybrid of either green or blue, you get a 7 loyalty Planeswalker. Her static ability is whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Her -1 is untap target permanent. Let's start off by talking about her static ability. Whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So if you get her out on turn 3, because she only costs 3, you're going to see in a little bit, but there are creatures that cost 4 that have 4 power. So she could trigger the very next turn. As well, too, later in the game when you have more mana, you could cast her and follow it up immediately with a creature that costs 4 or more, thus being able to draw a card. Now, extra card draw in pretty much any deck is usually welcome. One of Blue's strengths is the fact that it has a lot of extra card draw. One of the ways you'll be able to fight off a deck like, I keep going back to it, but the Gideon War of the Spark deck is the fact that that deck has no extra card draw. So they have a bunch of cheap creatures, but once their hand is empty, they are top decking constantly. They don't have options. They have to live and die by whatever they draw at the very top of their deck. You, on the other hand, have a good chance with this deck to have a full hand at almost any given time. This gives you more options. This gives you more possibilities to draw that card you need at just the right time, or even have it already in your hand and hold it back for the right moment to use it. So even though Gideon's deck will have a stronger start, this deck is going to be able to outlast a lot of decks which maybe have a really quick start that empties their hand on the board. So once again, if you can start to stabilize early enough, the card draw alone in this deck should help you push through to a possible victory. Okay, so we've talked enough about her card draw ability. Let's talk about the -1 ability, untap target permanent. Now, keep in mind, this is target permanent, not target non-land permanent. So you can use this ability if you wanted to untap one of your land, giving you an extra mana per turn. This in turn will allow you to cast some larger creatures than you probably would have before, and once again gives you a better chance of triggering her ability because the larger creatures usually have larger power to go along with them. However, even if you don't want to use this for ramp, you can still use it to untap one of your larger creatures. Let's say you have a big creature. It's a great attacker because nothing your opponent has can really block it properly. But you also want to be able to hold it back as a blocker. Swing in with that creature during your attack phase, and during your second main phase, use her ability, untap it. Now you have the best of both worlds. It was an attacker, now it's the blocker you need for the next turn. So even though overall Kyora isn't one of my favorite uncommon planeswalkers that they've created with War of the Spark, I do think she is a good addition to this deck. Okay, so now that we've talked about the Planeswalker, the exclusive cards, and the only other Planeswalker in this deck, let's move on to the creatures now in order of converted mana cost. Now, there are no one-drop creatures in this deck, which is unfortunate because there is one in particular from War of the Spark that I think would have worked really well in this deck. However, I'll talk about that one at the end of the video when I give my sort of overall thoughts on the deck. Instead, let's go to the 2-drops and talk about Merfolk Skydiver. So for a green and a blue, you get a 1/1 Merfolk Mutant. It has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It's got another ability, which is pay 3, a green and a blue, and proliferate. Now, one of the good things about the proliferate ability that it has is it's not a tap ability, which means if you have the mana, you could actually use it multiple times. Now, granted, that would require you to have at least 10 mana available, which is kind of unlikely, but still, it allows you to, at the very least, use this ability and not have to tap it down. So you could swing in with it on the same turn, or you could have already swung in with it. It could be midway through attacking, and then you use this ability. So it's a nice bit of versatility. It's also what they refer to as a mana sink, because a lot of the time later in the game, you do have a bunch of mana available to you, but not much to do with it. So this allows you to sink some of that otherwise unused mana and do something useful with it. So what that means is even though this enters as a 1/1, you could use its ability on itself, making it a 2/2 flyer for 2, which is fairly decent. I actually quite like this creature in this deck. It works well with a bunch of the other creatures that you're going to see in a bit. Proliferate in this deck is always great, and having it sort of on a stick like this is going to be very, very useful later in the game. And I also like the versatility of its enter the battlefield effect so that if you don't want to put the +1/+1 counter on the Skydiver, you don't have to. You can choose another creature on the battlefield and do that instead. Maybe you want to pump up a creature bigger that makes it a better blocker or a better attacker. You do have that option. At the very worst, this enters as a 1/1 flyer for 2 with an extra ability a little later on in the game. So overall, Merfolk Skydiver, even though there's only 2 copies of it, I think is a nice inclusion in the deck. Moving on, we have another 2-drop creature. This time it is pollenbright Druid. For 1 and a green, you get a 1/1 elf druid. It has, when it enters the battlefield, choose 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, or proliferate. Now, much like with the Skydiver, this enters as a 1/1, but you can use its ability on itself, so it can become a 2/2. Now, one of the big draws of this card is the fact that you do have a choice between putting the +1/+1 counter on target creature or proliferating. So early in the game, it's great when it hits the battlefield. It adds a +1/+1 counter to another creature. Late in the game, proliferate. Overall, this is a decent card to get in your hand almost any time during the game. So next up, we're going to leapfrog past the 3-drop spot because we've already talked about the only 3-drop creature we have in this deck, which is one of the exclusive cards. And instead, we're going to go to the 4-drops and talk about Bloom Hulk. So for 3 and 1 green, you get a 4/4 plant elemental creature, and when it enters the battlefield, proliferate. On a side note, I do realize a lot of the times that I pronounce the word proliferate, I'm pronouncing it as if it has 2 L's, which it does not, but it is just not a word that naturally rolls off my tongue. Anyway, at its worst, this card is a 4/4 for 4, which isn't the greatest ever, but it's also not bad. It's a good blocker, it's a good attacker, but the fact that it can also proliferate helps a lot with a lot of the other cards in this deck. Also, as I mentioned before, with Kyora, this will trigger her draw ability. So if she's out on turn 3 and this comes out on turn 4, you're going to get to draw an extra card. Next up, still in the 4-drop spot, we have 1 copy of Spark Double. For 3 and 1 blue, you get a 0/0 illusion creature. You may have Spark Double enter the battlefield as a copy of a creature or planeswalker you control, except it enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it if it's a creature. It enters with an additional loyalty counter on it if it's a planeswalker, and it isn't legendary if that permanent is legendary. So right off the bat, I really like this creature. Now, granted, it does rely on you having another creature or planeswalker on the battlefield, but chances are you're going to have that with this particular deck. It's a creature-heavy deck, and if you can get this out when Jace is on the battlefield, that is going to be incredible. You're going to have 2 Jace planeswalkers on the battlefield. That can make a huge difference in this game because that means that the static ability of Jace will trigger twice. That means that the +1 ability can be used for each of the planeswalkers. You're going to be able to draw 2 extra cards per turn, and because each Jace is going to trigger when the static ability triggers, that means up to 2 different creatures can get a +1/+1 counter on it. Now, sadly, there is only one copy of this, so you probably won't be able to have it in your hand every single game, and most likely you're not going to be able to use it to copy Jace. But still, I do like the design of this card, so even if it's more of a fun edition than a super useful edition, I still like the fact that this card is in the deck. Alrighty, moving on now from the 4 drops, we go into the 5 drops, and we have Essence Hydra. For 3, a green and a blue, you get a 4/4 Hydra mutant. It has trample. Essence Hydra enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each loyalty counter on planeswalkers you control. Whenever 1 or more loyalty counters are put on planeswalkers you control, put that many +1/+1 counters on Essence Hydra. Now, much like with Spark Double, you do only get 1 copy of this card in the deck, but there is a good chance this could have a serious impact to the game if it's able to hit the board. As well, too, this is one card that definitely makes me happy that they included a second Planeswalker in this deck, because granted, Jace would be nice to have on the battlefield when this comes out, but Kiora costs only 3 to have out, and her starting loyalty is 7. So even if you've used her -1 ability a couple times, if she's out when this hits on turn 5, this creature can get huge right off the bat. On top of which, if you do have Jace out and you're able to +1 him, this is going to continue to get +1/+1 counters. It's also going to get additional +1/+1 counters from any number of creatures, which give creatures +1/+1 counters. Anything that proliferates is going to help this creature out. But the absolute best effect that could possibly happen with this card is if this is on the battlefield with counters on it, and you have a Planeswalker on the battlefield with counters on it, and you proliferate. Because that means this is going to get an additional +1/+1 counter on it. Your Planeswalker is going to get an additional loyalty counter on it. That's going to trigger this, and then this is going to get an additional +1/+1 counter on it. This card can be absolutely bonkers. There's only 1 copy, which is the one thing that I do not like about this card, is the fact there's only 1 copy of it in this deck. It costs 5, it's a little costly, but for everything it can do with this deck, it means that your opponent is going to have to deal with it as quickly as possible, or they will be as dead as possible very soon. Okay, so next up we have a less exciting but still rather useful 5-drop. We have 2 copies of Wordscale Crocodile. For 4 and 1 green, you get a 5/3 Crocodile with hexproof. So even though this doesn't have much in the way of toughness, it does have quite a bit of power to it. Plus, there are so many +1/+1 counters that can be flying around that this could easily get pumped up higher and higher after a very short time being on the battlefield. As well, too, because it has hexproof, it makes it much harder for your opponent to get rid of. They can't simply target it with removal. Now, granted, if you are playing against the Gideon War, the Spark deck, they do have Kaya, which has the static ability of ignoring hexproof on creatures. But still, that doesn't happen very often, and it's not exactly the most likely scenario that you're going to encounter. So chances are this is going to be very difficult for your opponents to remove any other way than simply having to throw one of their creatures under the crocodile. Now we move on past the 5 drops into 6-drop creatures. We have 2 copies of Kiora's Dambreaker. For 5 and 1 blue, you get a 5/6 Leviathan, and when it enters the battlefield, proliferate. Now, granted, this is not going to make an entrance till later in the game due to its cost, but it does proliferate, which can be definitely useful with this deck. It also has a 5/6 body, making it a great attacker, a great blocker. There's not much that can go toe-to-toe with this that isn't going to lose that fight. So yes, this creature is just slightly better than your regular sort of vanilla creature, but really once it hits the battlefield, that's all it's going to be doing for the rest of the game, is just being a big, scary creature to threaten your opponent. And speaking of big scary things which simply hit the board and stay big and scary, our final creature in this deck is Primordial Worm. For 4 and 2 green, you get a 7/6 worm creature. Now this creature is about as vanilla as it comes. Now for those of you who, I've said the term a few times already, but for those of you unfamiliar with the term vanilla when it comes to card games like this, it's basically just a creature that doesn't do anything else other than be a creature. So yes, not super exciting or sexy or anything, but it does put pressure on your opponent, especially if their side of the battlefield isn't really up to snuff compared to yours. Okay, so that is it for all the creature cards in this deck. Now it's time to move on and talk about the non-creature cards, and we're going to start off in the 3-drop spot with a card called Band Together. For 2 and 1 green, you get an instant that says, up to 2 target creatures you control each deal damage equal to their power to another target creature. Now, a few things to point out with this card. First of all, it's the only instant speed spell you have in this entire deck. It is also the only bit of somewhat direct removal you have in this deck, and you only get 2 copies of it. The only other type of removal you're going to have is basically your creatures swinging in and doing regular combat damage. So you want to hold on to these cards until you really need them. Gideons Deck, for More of the Spark, has a bunch of removal. You do not have that luxury, so hold these cards back. Now, on the plus side, this is fairly decent removal. It's not unconditional, which would have been great. Being able to straight up destroy a creature or exile a creature is always better. But having 2 of your creatures be able to use their power to deal damage to one other creature that your opponent has, chances are, especially in this deck, that's going to be favorable. It's going to get rid of pretty much anything they have on the board, most likely. The other good thing about this is that even though Magic has printed cards in the past where there's a fight mechanic, meaning the creatures deal damage to each other, this is completely one-sided. Your creatures are going to deal damage to another creature, but they are not going to receive any damage back from it. So this means if you use this pre-combat, you can still swing in and don't have to worry about your creatures having damage already on them before combat damage goes through. Okay, now still in the 3 drops, we have a sorcery this time, and we've got 2 copies of Courage in Crisis. For 2 and a green, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, then proliferate. So as you've seen with pretty much all of the creature cards I've shown before, being able to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature is great, but the fact that this can also proliferate afterwards is even better. That basically means that you're putting 2 +1/+1 counters on one creature at minimum. And that is not even taking into account how many other creatures or planeswalkers you already have on the battlefield that have counters, which could benefit from the proliferate part of this card. So is it the greatest card in the world? No. Would I trade it in for removal in a heartbeat? 100%. But still, you work with what you have, and this card can have a good impact on a game. Next up, we have yet another 3-drop. This time in blue, though, it is Jace's Triumph. For 2 and 1 blue, you get a sorcery, draw 2 cards. If you control a Jace Planeswalker, draw 3 cards instead. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say this is a bad card draw card. It's not bad. It's not great by any means. It does draw you at minimum 2 cards. If you do have Jace out, you know, you do get to draw 3 cards, but also if you have Jace out, do you really need that extra card draw? I guess you could always use extra card draw. It is the lifeblood pretty much of any sort of mid to late game. But still, it's not the greatest. You do only get 1 copy of it. But yeah, chances are if it does pop into your hand, you're going to want to use it right away, pretty much at any time, unless you're already doing extremely well as far as hand size. But yeah, it's very mediocre. So it's got a place in this deck. It's not as exciting as maybe some other card draw cards might have been. Moving right along, we have New Horizons. For 2 and 1 green, we have an enchantment aura. Enchant land. When it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Enchanted land has tap, add 2 mana of any one color. Now, in a deck like this that has a fair number of higher costed creatures, I do want a bit more ramp than this provides. Now, granted, Kyora, we saw that before. She can untap lands that you already had tapped, so that can act as sort of like a bit of ramp as well too. But I would have really liked more ramp. At the very end of this, when I give my overview or my final thoughts on the deck, I will sort of talk about, once again, this one particular card that I think could have been added that would have fixed, for me, the ramp issues that I think this deck has. But at least they did give you some sort of ramp in the form of New Horizons. So yeah, what this card allows you to do is play a little bit of catch up, because even though this deck doesn't have the strongest early game, it has a very strong mid to late game, and this will help you get there just that little bit quicker than you normally would. Now, just be careful when you do put this on a land, because you can tap it for 2 mana of any one color. So that means if it's on a forest, you can then tap the forest for 2 green or 2 blue, but you can't tap it for both a green and a blue. And finally, now we move to the last non-creature card in this deck. And for those of you hoping we'd ever leave the land of 3-drops, we're not going to. It is Stealth Mission. We get 2 copies of this card. It costs 2 and 1 blue for a sorcery. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on creature you control. That creature can't be blocked this turn. Now, this is obviously not the most insane spell you could ever hope for, but I do like this particular card in the deck. I think it works well early game, mid game, and late game. Early game because this can go really well with some of your 2-drops. It's on the board, and you're able to pump it up with 2 extra counters and at least get 1 easy swing in with it as well too. That's going to allow you to sort of compete with another deck, not unlike the Gideon deck for More of the Spark, which may have a stronger start with their first couple turns. And then mid to late game, I think this card can have a great impact, because at that point, hopefully you will have developed some of your larger, more scarier threats. And not only is this going to pump them up, it's going to give them a free swing to do hopefully lethal damage when your opponent isn't expecting it. So there you go, folks. That is every single non-land card in this deck. So before we move on to the next part of this video, let's quickly talk about the mana base, and that includes 4 copies of Simic Guildgate, 10 islands, and 11 forests. Alrighty, now before I give you my final parting thoughts on the deck, let's get to what I like to call the dessert of these videos, and that is open up those 2 packs of War of the Sparks that came with this particular Planeswalker deck. Now, I am going to be switching to a different microphone during the pack opening, so there will be a slight difference in my voice, but hopefully that won't be too distracting, and it will end once the packs are done. Okay, so as of this recording, these packs, along with the 2 previous packs that I opened up in the Gideon Planeswalker deck opening, are the only packs I've opened so far. The only physical packs. I've opened up Magic Arena packs for this. So what I'm going to do, because there's only 2 packs, I'm going to read off the title of each of the cards, and then I'm only going to read off fully any Planeswalkers that pop up, and of course, the rare and or mythic. So we have Teo's Light Shield, No Escape, Turret Ogre, Vivian's Grizzly. She reminds me so much of Green Lantern with the constructs, the green animal constructs. I like that character because of that, because Green Lantern, by far my favorite character, despite the fact that his movie wasn't anywhere near as good as I thought it would be. Anyways, Vraska's Finisher, which is a card in Draft and Sealed that did extremely well for me. This is an amazing card, because all you have to do, you don't have to do combat damage. You just have to ping one of your opponent's creatures before this hits the board, and it can take care of it right away. Saheeli's Silverwing, Bloom Hulk, Charmed Stray. So we're seeing some of the cards that you're actually going to see in the Planeswalker decks as well. Aven Eternal. Now our first uncommon is Paradise Druid. I really like the design of this card. I like the fact that it basically protects itself with hexproof as long as you haven't tapped it yet. So yeah, this is it's nice little ramp that protects itself when it comes on the battlefield, as opposed to like Llanowar Elf, which can get burned away right away. Grateful Apparition. And we have one of the uncommon Planeswalkers. It is Angrath, Captain of Chaos, which is such a cool name, actually. The 5 loyalty Planeswalker. His static ability is creatures you control have menace, which is not an insignificant sort of static ability to have. And his -2 is a mass 2, so which we haven't read off yet. Put 2 +1/+1 counters on an army you control. If you don't control one, create a 0/0 black zombie army creature token first. So we opened up one of the army tokens in the other Planeswalker deck, and moving on to we get a mythic. And man, if this was in my sealed pool or something during either like a draft or any sort of limited play, I would be thrilled. These God Eternals are so difficult to deal with. So this is God Eternal Bontu. It is a mythic. It costs 3 and 2 black for a 5/6 zombie god. It has menace. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice any number of other permanents, then draw that many cards. So that ability, depending on the strategy you've got going on the board, may not have too much of an impact, but when it dies or is put into exile from the battlefield, you may put it into its owner's library, 3rd from the top. Anytime I was not unlucky enough to open up one of these in any of the early release events, but I squared off against people who opened up these continually. They are such a pain in the butt to get rid of, just constantly being able to sort of put it back near the top of their library. So yeah, it's a very, very cool card. I'm curious how much play the gods are going to see in Constructed shortly after the set comes out, but in Limited, these are crazy bombs, and definitely first pickable. For those of you who don't speak slurred English. Oh, and we have a foil. It is an uncommon foil. It is Merfolk Skydiver. So for a green and a blue, you get a 1/1 Merfolk Mutant. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Proliferate as well, too. So we have these in the Planeswalker deck, the Jace Planeswalker deck, but now we have a foil version, which is kind of nice. We also got a Swamp as our land, and our token is one of the spirit tokens. These are one of the tokens that I believe the only card that creates these in the set is Ugin. So still kind of a cool one to have. And as well too, I was going to mention this quickly. I mentioned this in the previous one. We do have a Token of the Month Club here on Brain Pulp where we get exclusive? Let me try that again. We have exclusive tokens created for Brain Pulp TV each and every month. And you folks can sign up for it. To get these tokens mailed directly to your door, you can sign up for getting between 1 and 10 of these tokens, or that month's token. And I believe, unless plans change in the last minute, we are going to be doing the Amass Army tokens
for May. So keep a lookout for that. And if not, then there will be definitely out in June, because we want to do something that's specific to War of the Spark set. So anyways, that's the last time I'll mention the Token of the Month Club. Moving on, just before I do that, there is an advertisement for the War of the Spark book, which is something I'm looking forward to reading, or more likely listen to it on audiobook form, because I can actually do that while I'm working. So here we go. We're moving on to the second and final pack in the Planeswalker deck box. It is Teo's Light Shield, which I think I've opened up in almost every single pack so far. Spellkeeper Weird, which also looks very familiar. So does Turret Ogre. Okay, here we go. Primordial Worm. I don't think I've opened up that yet. Kaya's Ghost Form. This is a very useful card. I found it to be very useful, especially if you're able to put it on one of your more powerful or useful planeswalkers. It's extremely useful, at least in the limited play that I've played. So we have Callous Dismissal, Nahiri's Stoneblades, Band Together, which is normally a really great bit of removal unless your opponent has the Wanderer on the battlefield, and in which case you just wasted this card, which I'm speaking from experience, so don't do that. Look out for the Wanderer before you cast Band Together. We have Prismite, and our first uncommon is Watley's Raptor. Then we have Bond of Insight, and we have, so as far as I know, because there's supposed to be a Planeswalker in every single deck, the fact that there is not an uncommon Planeswalker here means that my rare or mythic card is going to be a Planeswalker, so I'm pretty excited about that. We have our final uncommon is Interplanar Beacon, and our rare is, let's test this theory, Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord. So it is one of the rare Planeswalkers. So for 2, a white and a black, you get a 4 loyalty Sorin Planeswalker. As long as it's your turn, creatures and Planeswalkers you control have lifelink. The -2 is Sorin deals 1 damage to target player or Planeswalker, and the -X is return target creature card with converted mana cost X from your graveyard to the battlefield. That creature is a vampire in addition to its other types. I was able to play around with this in some of the early release events, and it's a very useful Planeswalker. And when you have something like Vraska's Finisher in your hand, his +2 ability allows you to deal 1 damage to target player or Planeswalker, and when she comes out, if you deal it to the Planeswalker, when Vraska's Finisher comes out, it basically acts like immediate removal for that Planeswalker. So it can really tag team well with certain cards in this set. But overall, it's great. And just the static ability alone, being able to give your creatures and Planeswalkers lifelink is absolutely great. So this is the first physical rare Planeswalker that I've opened, so I'm kind of happy about that. Moving on, we have another foil. We've actually been doing not too bad with foils, not rarity-wise, but in number-wise when it comes to these packs. Gateway Plaza. So it is a land gate card, and Gateway Plaza enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless you pay 1, and you can add 1 mana of any color. So that is our foil. Our land is an island, and our token is a servo token. And on the back it's talking about Friday Night Magic. So there we go. So that is the second pack from this Planeswalker deck box.
Well, I'm not sure if you guys saw the overview video for the Gideon Oathsworn deck yet, but I don't want to spoil anything, but I will say I'm a little bit happier with what I opened up in these packs than in the packs during that video. However, now that we're done opening up booster packs, let's start talking about what my overall thoughts on this deck are. Now, I do this with all the Planeswalker decks I do an overview for, but when I look at a Planeswalker deck, I do so through a different lens than I would a Challenger deck. Challenger deck is meant to be competitive right out of the box. It's meant to have more power to it. Planeswalker decks are mostly for fun, for newer players, for learning Magic. So when I say a Planeswalker deck is powerful or not powerful, I mean that specifically amongst the realm of Planeswalker decks, not Magic decks in general. Okay, so now that I have that disclaimer out of the way, let me just start off by saying I don't actually think this is a bad Planeswalker deck. In fact, I think it's got a very strong mid to late game to it. It's just a matter of if you're going to be able to survive till the mid to late game. Now, a lot of the times when these Planeswalker decks come out, they're usually compared to the other Planeswalker decks. So the Gideon War of the Spark deck is going to be compared to this one. And that makes sense because they come out at the same time, they're from the same set, and a lot of the times they're the ones that are going to be played against each other. So while, once again, I don't think this is a bad Planeswalker deck, I don't think it's as strong as Gideon's. But it could have easily been as strong, if not stronger, with just the inclusion of one particular card. Now, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. First, let me explain why I think Gideon's deck is currently stronger on a head-to-head matchup against this deck. So one of the biggest issues that Planeswalker decks tend to have is consistency. Because they want to sprinkle as many different cards in a deck as possible, there are very few playsets or 4 copies of, or even 3 copies of a lot of the cards. When you do have playsets or 3 copies of a card in a deck, the consistency increases. You have a better chance of having those in your opening hand, and that's extremely useful when it comes to being able to play a certain strategy. So I'm not sure if you've seen the Gideon overview, but I'm just going to quickly talk about just 2 cards from it and sort of let you know what I mean about this consistency issue. So there's a card in the Gideon deck called Charm Stray. It's a 1/1 for 1 white mana. It enters the battlefield, and if there's another copy of Charm Stray already on the battlefield, you can put a +1/+1 counter on any other copies of Charm Stray. All of those cards have lifelink. Then in the 2-drop spot, you have a Johnny's Pridemate. So it's a 2/2 that enters the battlefield for 1 and 1 white. However, every time you gain life, you can put a +1/+1 counter on it, and there are 3 copies of that card. Now, a Johnny's Pridemate is a card you're seeing a lot in life gain or weenie decks. It's extremely powerful because you can get life gain going super early, like the second it's on the battlefield on turn 2, and it starts pumping it up, and it makes you force your opponent to deal with it, or they're going to get crushed. So the fact that they give 4 copies of Charm Stray and 3 copies of Johnny's Pridemate to that deck means there's a very good chance both of those cards are going to be in your opening hand if you're playing that deck. And that in turn means Gideon's deck has crazy good early game. Now, jumping back to Jace's deck, the lowest cost creatures in this deck are 2-drops. 2-drops that when they hit the battlefield on turn 2 can only ever hope to be at most a 2/2. And that means if you're squaring off against Gideon's deck, you're already sort of behind when it comes to creature and power level. Now, granted, Jace's deck dwarfs Gideon's deck when it comes to their mid to late game creatures. The creatures that you can get in this deck are amazing later on, but that's not going to matter if you don't even survive to the mid game. Now, I don't expect every deck to have the answer to every other deck on the planet, because that's just impossible. Certain colors have certain strengths that other colors just don't have. Gideon's deck has a lot of straight up removal because it's a white-black deck, and white and black both have a fair amount of removal. Now, on the flip side of the coin, Jace's deck has a fair amount of card draw. That's extremely useful, whereas Gideon's has limited to no extra card draw from what I remember. So there are certain bonuses to playing blue as well too, even if you're not playing with counter spells. However, card draw a lot of the time is typically more useful in the mid game. And the only way to reach the mid game is to not die in the very early stages of the game, which is what it sort of looks like will happen if you square off against the Gideon deck with this deck. So the way I see it, there are 2 main things that this deck needs. 1, it needs early game survivability, and it also needs ramp, because you want to be able to get to your mid game quicker than your opponent can get to their mid game, which means you want to be able to pump out more mana on turn 4 than your opponents can even on turn 5 or 6. Now, granted, this deck does come with a bit of ramp, but a very small amount of it. New Horizons matched with Kyora's ability to untap 1 single land per turn isn't really a decent amount of ramp. It's okay, but it's not going to really turn the tides for you. And as well too, that's a total of 3 cards in the entire deck, which can give you that ramp ability. You need a bit more. So when it comes to ramp, when it comes to early game survivability, there is one card in particular from War of the Spark that I'm surprised they didn't put 2 or 3 copies of into this deck. It's a common card, and I'm about to probably mispronounce it. It's a Boreal Grazer. Now, a Boreal Grazer is a 1-drop, cost 1 green. It's a 0/3 beast creature with reach, and when it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. Okay, so let me explain everything about this creature so you know why I think this card, above pretty much any other card in the set, should have been included in this deck. First of all, it's a 1-drop for a deck which currently has no 1-drops, so it would be a great turn 1 play for this deck. Second of all, it's a 0/3, which makes it a great early game blocker. It also has reach, so it can block both ground units and air units. Plus, it makes it a wonderful target for a turn 2 play for one of the creatures you have that can enter the battlefield and give another creature a +1/+1 counter. So all of a sudden, this is a 1/4 blocker or attacker. It's also common, so it's not going to mess up the rarity scale that they tend to have with these decks, so they don't want the power levels to go through the roof. But most importantly, when it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. It is ramp. So for a deck whose main strength is in the mid to late game that has a harder time getting there, this card would be absolutely incredible. You put 3 to 4 copies of this card in the deck, you can almost guarantee yourself at least 1 in your opening hand. Well, guarantee is probably a little bit strong, but you'll have a very high chance of having one of these in your opening hand. And it could have done a huge amount of work for you. It could have fended off an early game, and it could have also given you ramp. The two things that I think this deck is lacking, but could definitely benefit from. So for me at least, this little 1-drop common creature could have easily made the difference between this just being an okay Planeswalker deck to one of the stronger Planeswalker decks that they've created, and definitely a match for the Gideon Oathsworn deck. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, we haven't recorded our episodes of the Mana Cave where we play these decks against each other yet, so I don't know 100% for sure that this isn't going to stack up well against the Gideon deck. I'm fairly certain, based on all the other Planeswalker deck battles we've had, and sort of the deck list in general, but I can't be 100% sure that my assessment is correct here. In fact, nothing would make me happier to be wrong, because I really want a decent blue Planeswalker deck to have come out. And this is so close, so very close, but just not quite there yet. Once again though, even without that alteration, I still think this isn't a bad Planeswalker deck. So if you bought this deck instead of the Gideon deck, and you've heard what I've said so far, now you're worried that you bought the lesser of the two decks, don't be. If you prefer blue decks, if you prefer Simic decks, and you bought this deck, then you bought the right deck. These decks can easily be tweaked for next to no money to make them better, and you don't have to follow the rules that Wizards had to follow. So you don't just have to use War of the Spark cards. There are a ton of other cards which are still currently standard legal, which could easily be added to this on a budget, which will make it way better. Now, granted, the Grazer would probably be one of my first choices, but that is for War of the Spark. So you could put Incubation Druid. Now, I know that's a rare card. I don't think it costs that much, but you may want to price it out, see if it's in your budget as far as improving this deck. Also, cards like Growth Spiral, which is an instant which allows you to draw a card and put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. That's also going to help you with your ramp. Also, if you want to add different creatures into this, I'm not even going to mention the Hydroid Crassus, though that is an incredible card, but I think it costs a ridiculous amount of money. But even something like the Galloping Lizrog might be an interesting addition to this deck. Also as well too, you don't have to follow Wizards' rule about putting no counterspells in Planeswalker decks. Put as many as you want if you feel that's going to help, and I do think a certain number of them will help. You could even put something like Frilled Mystic in, which is 2 green, 2 blue for a 3/2 creature with flash that has a counterspell attached to it. Even conditional counterspells could be great in this. Essence Capture, for example. It puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and it counters target creature spell. So if you're going to be playing mostly against the Gideon deck or another Planeswalker deck, those are all basically creature-based. So that could be an effective counterspell in this deck. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's a decent deck for a Planeswalker deck. It's not the best Planeswalker deck out there. Could have been, but not quite. But it can easily become a much stronger deck with just a little bit of tender loving care. So there you go, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it a bit informative. Please let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns in the comment section. You can also just let me know how your pre-release went, or if you've had a chance to play around with these decks. Do you agree with my assessment of the decks? Do you think maybe I was wrong about which deck is stronger than the other one? Please let me know all those things in the comment section below, because I'd love to hear from you guys. You can also follow or contact me on Twitter @BrainPulpTV, or you can just email me, ed@brainpulp.tv. Oh, and one more thing before we go. I did sort of briefly touch upon it at the beginning of the video, but we are going to be battling it out with these two decks on the live Paper Magic show that we do here on BrainPulp TV called the Mana Cave. So that's something to definitely keep an eye out for. Hopefully that should be released sometime within a week of this video being released. Alrighty, so now with all that said, take care, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day, night, morning, evening, whatever it is, wherever you are. May all your pulls be mythics, and I'll see you all again very soon.